Everybody, this is wxlive.us webinar with Uncle Pete, session number 20 on January 3rd, 2014. So this is our webinar number 99. Do you want to do 100, Pete? We should reserve that
wouldn't
for you.
mind somebody else jumping in there. Did we ever hear from John? I thought John had one ready to go.
Oh, he was on vacation. He was gone, and he says he's at a place that does not have very good internet. So it's all yours, and you're gonna do loopers and some really neat stuff today, eh?
Yep, that's what we're doing today. So,
Okay.
so loopers they're definitely the heart of almost every e-commerce website out there. You know, if you look at Amazon or any of the big e-commerce sites, you'll recognize that it's loopers driving their sites. It just lends itself. That's the way to do a e-commerce type interface on the web. And for the most part, I find that's also true of most business apps for the web as well. I find that loopers just work better, give me a richer interface for business web apps. The reason why is because they're so much more versatile with the type of controls that can be inside your looper and so forth. So, you know, just how on Windows, it's always a table control unless I run into a specific reason for it not to be. When I'm doing websites, it tends to be a looper unless I run into a specific reason for it not to be a looper. So that's one of those differences between Windows development and web development. And it's one of the reasons that I spend so much time beating and banging on the looper control, figuring these type of features out, is because in web design, I just constantly run into more and more things that I need to do with loopers and pushing that envelope further and further. So this example is the IGBT website. It's an e-commerce website for electronics parts. Pretty typical type of e-commerce website. And the requirement that we're working on today was we needed a page that would show you all the product categories broken down into you have a master category and then a subcategory. So as we're seeing the website here, you have IGBT modules, and then you have several subcategories of those. You have diode modules and several subcategories of those on down the line. And from a visual standpoint, we wanted to have a header for each master category with an image and a title. And then we wanted the subcategories listed as 3 columns underneath those headings, you know, just from a visual standpoint. If we'd ran these down, it'd look silly and use up a lot of page space. You know, one of the keys on websites, especially e-commerce marketing websites, is the concept they call of above the fold. You want as much information to be on that first view of the page as possible. So by doing 3 columns, we accomplish that. So this is the interface that we're going to reproduce today. You know, it's nothing fancy, but if you're just starting with WebDev and loopers, you'll scratch your head a little bit trying to figure out how to make this happen. At least I did when I tried to do it the very first time. So let's get started. What I've done I set up a little sample database for us. I created a product group category. I'm not saying this is the right database design or anything like that, just trying to create something nice and simple, easy to understand so that we can do a demonstration here. So in this product group table, you got a master group and a subgroup, and then I created a composite key over both of those so that I could get my sort properly. So then I just wrote a little bit of quick and easy code right here that's commented out. Let me uncomment that to make it a little easier to read. I just looped through 10 times, and then within that did an inner loop randomly between 10 and 25 times and created a bunch of records that are master group and subgroup. And if we go back over and look at the data generated from that, we'll see that we've got subgroup 1 through 10 for master group 1, subgroup 1 through 13 for master group 2, on down the line. So there we've got some extraordinary fancy sample data to test with. But, makes it nice and easy for us to do some testing. So now that we have our sample data, we're going to go create a page. And we're going to call this page, we'll go ahead and save it, call it just test page. And then just to make my life easier, I'm going to make that the first dynamic page so that when I click the go button, that page will run. All right, so now I want to add a looper to this page. I want to base it on a file. And I want to base it on the product group file. I want to display, the only thing we're going to display right now is just the subgroup. We want to sort it by our composite key. We want it to be a classic. We're going to show all the data, so we set the maximum number of rows to 0, and we want it to be in 3 columns. And at that point, let me grab this thing. It looks like it got over. Yep. At that point, we can actually run this thing. And it's incredibly ugly, but we see that we've got our subgroup 1, and of course 10 is sorted next because it's an alpha sort instead of a numeric sort. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then we start with the next group of 1 through whatever for group 2. We don't have any headings or anything in there right now. So, but we did get a start at what we're trying to do. Okay, so now the next step is let's change this thing around visually a little bit to make it a little more appealing. First thing I'm going to do is when we populated that looper, it populated this control as a formatted display control. Basically, it's the same thing as an edit control, except it's not editable. Instead, I'm going to delete that. And I'm just going to populate it with a good old-fashioned static control. And I'm just going to call that static subgroup. I'm going to shrink up our looper so that it isn't quite so large. And then I'm also going to edit the style. Now notice if I click once, I've actually selected that static. If I click again, I've selected the looper now, and I can tell I've selected the looper because of the little blue dashed lines is now displayed. So now if I go into description, I'm into the looper description. I want to come down here to style. I want to make those even and odd rows. I don't want a background on them. That'll get rid of those gray boxes that we're seeing. The other thing we wanted to do was make sure that our attribute is still attached to that new static that we just created and that it's linked to subgroup. Okay, that looks a little better. Obviously, we still don't have any breaks or anything in place, but definitely a little better than what we started with. So now let's add some breaks to this looper. So we come back into the looper description. And on the content tab, you see a section down here for breaks. The button right here is to edit the break. So we click there, and we want to create a break on master group. At the point we do that, now notice it created a header and a footer section to go along with our detail section we already had. So just by defining that break, we now have our breaking
That's
going
pretty
on.
tricky, yeah. That's pretty tricky there, Pete.
Yeah, it's very subtle, and it really gets funky, as we're going to see here shortly, how you resize this thing. It's another one of those things where you got to start understanding how their interface, how they want you to work it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want a static up here for the master group. So I'm lazy, I'm just going to copy it. And again, you know, like we've seen in other areas, if I hold over the header there is turning green, that tells me that this control is going to be dropped into that header section of that looper. So I'll drop it in there, and I go call this, and I'll call this master group. And then we need to get into the looper, and we need to add an attribute to populate that master group. Choose that static we just created and link that to our product group master group. Okay. Now, since this is a heading, I want it to be a little nicer than that. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make this 24-point bold and say it doesn't fit. Okay, now here's where it gets a little tricky. How do I resize this thing? If right there I'm selecting the static, I need to be selecting the looper. So I select the looper. But you don't actually get to, you got to select the header of the looper, not the static, but the header of the looper. And then, as I stretch that down, see how it left the detail in the footer section and stretched that header. Now I can come in and stretch my static. Did you follow that? Any questions there? It's one of those things where you got to make sure you get the right one selected. And part of how you can tell is, I hope you can see there's these little, very hard to see little black dots that indicate where the detail section is. And let me show you what would have happened if I would have done that incorrectly. If I had selected the looper and done this, see, that would have made the detail section bigger. And now, you know, I could try to stretch that static, and now that static looks, you know, it looks right, but it's actually encroaching into the detail section. It didn't boost the header section. So you've got to make sure that you get the header section selected, then resize it, and it pushes everything else out appropriately. Okay? And now if we run our page, now we've got a header that's starting to look like what we're after. And in fact, at this point, you may be thinking that we're pretty close, but this is not spanning, and you can actually see it if you do some selecting there. Notice that that header is the exact same width as that first column. It is not spanning all three columns. And you may be thinking, well, that's just because there's not as much text there. But if we come in here and make this a very long title, make a couple of those that way, and then refresh this page, we will see that it word wraps it. It will not make it wider than that cell. And this, again, if you go back a couple of webinars, we talked about this before. WebDev, when it generates the HTML code, it's doing some cell positioning and table positioning to get things where you want them and size the way you want them. And it made some assumptions. If we were to go in and inspect these elements, we would see that it created a table cell inside the main table for the header. See, so there's our whole header cell, but inside it, it created one just for that column. So this is a problem that we've dealt with before. So how do we get around that? Well, just like before, thankfully, you guys have heard me preach it before. If you're going to do web dev development work, you need to spend a little time learning basic CSS and HTML, because at the end of the day, that is what you're doing. You're doing HTML. No matter how fancy WebDev is and what it does for you, at the end of the day, you're generating HTML. Let's go ahead and fix those so that we get rid of those extra long ones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a trick after seeing that and looking at the HTML code and playing around and doing some experimenting. I figured out that if I create something inside that header that takes up the full width, then it'll get generated properly so that it does span all three columns. So the first thing I need to do is figure out how wide do I need to make that. That's where the Google developer tools really come in handy. If I come up here and select this, and then come over here to computed, I see that that entire, to span all three columns, needs to be 936 pixels wide. So that's an important number for us to know, is 936, because that tells us that what we need to do is get something in there that's 936 wide to force that cell to take up all that space so that it doesn't wrap on us. So how do we accomplish all that? Well, the first thing we do is we get rid of our static here. And now, once again, this is why we need to learn HTML. We're going to use an HTML control in here instead. We're going to stuff it with HTML code. Okay, so we've created the HTML header control instead of the static. Now we need to go into the looper and instead of this attribute for master group now, we need an attribute for the HTML header. It will be linked to that HTML header control we just added. And we do not want it linked to any thing from the database because we're going to supply the values for it ourselves. And where do we provide those values? If we go into the code of the looper in the row display, and now I'm going to use one of those Julia Childs through the magic of television tricks. Steal that. And in the row display gets executed for every row of our looper. So what we're doing is we're saying every time it creates a new row in our looper, it's going to set the ATT HTML header, which is our attribute, equal to this. And what is this? Oops. Back over there. This is a standard HTML horizontal rule tag. And remember we said 936? Right, there's our 936. We're saying create a horizontal rule, 936 pixels wide, no border, make it white, make it 5 pixels high, with no margin. Okay, so now if we run it, we see that we now have our horizontal rule looking the way we want it to look. And in my first testing, I was actually getting a slightly different result for some reason. I was getting this horizontal rule taller, but strangely enough, this time we're not seeing that effect. But regardless, once we get into the next step, that kind of gets fixed by the HTML anyway. So now we've got our header actually spanning all 3 columns. It's forced it to, and if we go look now and inspect the elements, you'll see that it's now created, it still created all those extra, that extra table is still there. It's just that it let this table here for the actual header be the entire width instead of making it the width of 1 column. And it simply did that because there's something in it that's wide enough that it's forcing it out there. So it's another one of those, if you understand how HTML works, it really helps you get into how to make WebDev work. So now we've got our spanning going on. Now all we need to do is come back and get our actual text in place. Well, the first thing we need to do is come into our looper. We need to add an attribute to get our master group value back, because we need that in our code. And this is another one of those concepts, you've heard me talk before about there's certain concepts like hidden buttons and timers and pressing hidden buttons that are very important to your WebDev development. This is another one of those concepts, and this one took me a little while to figure out. An attribute in a looper does not have to be assigned to a window control. I used to always, when I wanted to hide something because I just need that value available for each row of the looper, I used to make these little hidden statics and assign the attribute to that hidden static. But eventually it dawned on me, they give me a none selection for a reason. So this is an attribute that I'm going to get a value of the master group in, but it's not assigned to any window control at all. So this is very similar to our Windev development of having a row in or a column in the table that we make hidden. It's just so that we have that value available for each row. So now we come back in to our code for displaying a row, and we grab our next little piece of code. And this code is just doing an HTML div tag and putting in that attribute that we just created and linked to the master group field from the database. So this will contain the value of that group, that master group. So we've created a div tag. What is this little class equals product group header section? Arnold, were you paying attention last week? You know what that is? Arnold.
Yeah, I was on a help call, a sport call. Sorry. What was the question?
You mean you weren't hanging on my every single word?
I wanted to, but the phone rang and I had to take it. It's a big client.
We were talking about. I created this div tag, and you notice this class equals product group header. You recognize that from last week, don't you?
Yeah, I do. That's like the selector for the formatting.
Yeah, that's the custom CSS. So
right.
If we come over.
Yeah, well, the thing is, they should call it Windev Css. It's not CSS to me.
Yeah, it's sort of CSS.
But it's built inside of their stuff. It's not in a CSS file.
Right. So there's our product group header, and it's 24-point bold white. So if you want to know any more about that, you need to watch last week's webinar. We're not gonna cover old ground, but we're using that CSS here to define our header as being 24 pixels. So now if we run it, ta-da, we now have a nice big header over each of our columns. Or I'm sorry, spanning our 3 columns. So the only requirement left that we haven't done so far is to get an image in there. And for this example, I'm going with a pretty, making some assumptions that what you're doing is those images are based on the master group name. So we grab that code. And all that's doing is creating an HTML image tag. We're assuming that our images are going to be in a product typed images directory right underneath our web directory. And all I'm doing here is replacing whatever the master group is, getting rid of the spaces. So if it's master group 1, I'm making it master group 1 with no spaces, .png. And all my images I know are a certain size because I made that a requirement of the graphics guy when he was creating the images. So at this point, we run it. And ta-da, we have an image, header, spanning 3 columns of our looper. We don't have images here because I only created a few for testing purposes. And we can actually come out here. This is our project directory. This is the web directory. There's that directory I created with master group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 10. And now, if in a production environment, you would have to do some work right here to get this directory to be proper for both your production server and your test server. But that's a topic of another webinar. Doesn't really have anything to do with what we're doing today with looper spanning columns.
You probably make that a variable anyway, wouldn't you?
Yeah, in fact, what I do is I've got some code that derives it based on, because you can pull information off of the browser of where the page is located, and from that I can derive where it needs to be, and I also can tell whether you're in test mode or not, and control it that way as well.
Sweet.
Because what happens is more than likely where you keep your images on your development machine is very different than where you keep your images on your production machine.
I try and partition my drives so that they're the same.
Yeah. Well,
just so that I don't have to think twice. So.
Yeah. Well, you are lucky enough that you're doing work for yourself. When you're doing work for 3 or 4 different
that's
clients.
true, eh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You don't have as much control over those crazy clients that come to you with their project is on the G drive.
Yeah.
So there we have it seemed pretty easy going through that, but again, had I not understood HTML and kind of dissected what was originally there, you won't find anything in the WebDev help that tells you that you can span that break over to 3 columns. There is no checkbox, and we get spoiled in WebDev to thinking that there should be a checkbox that says span the columns or something.
Just like Excel.
Yeah, exactly.
Span that bad boy.
Every once in a while, we have to actually do a little bit of real programming.
Oh,
so,
damn.
It's good to understand and know, at least at a rudimentary level, the underlying technologies that we're developing on.
Exactly. Good point.
And once I knew that and was able to dissect it a little bit and do some experimenting, I was able to get the result I wanted. And as you see, I mean, it's not rough by any means, for the visual effect that we achieved there. I don't think that's too much code, is it?
It could look. Yeah, it's not even that daunting if you break it down.
Yeah, that's all the code that's on that page. Everything else on that page is driven from the standard WebDev looper and table and links and all that. This is the only code on the entire page. Yeah, and this the only code on that entire page is those 3 lines of code. So for a page that we didn't spend a lot of time on it, but definitely doesn't look horrible considering how much time we spent on it. For 3 lines of code, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I'd want to be messing with JavaScript in that amount of time.
Excellent. Hal asks, what is a good resource to study or understand HTML? There's a lot. I mean, you can go to lynda.com and you just, if you Google, that's your friend. There's a lot of places. There's a lot of books.
It really is. You don't need anything elaborate. You need the HTML and CSS for dummies.
Yeah.
That's what you need. You don't need all the crazy tricks and fancy stuff and all that. All you need is the basic understanding. If you're able to create a 3 or 4 page what we call a brochure site, which is just a static site for a small business that says, mom and pop 7-Eleven with a couple of pages with, some contact information and that sort of thing. If you're able to open up Dreamweaver or Coffee Cup is what I use to edit HTML code, if you're able to create a website of that caliber directly in HTML, that's all the more you need to know. And like Arnold said, there's a bunch of different sources out there to learn.
It depends how you learn. Yeah, it depends how you learn. I kind of like, the reason why I like lynda.com is they go through either at a real beginners or advanced stage where somebody's explaining and they frame everything, and so I just like them describing it to me rather than me reading all the time. But sometimes reading is faster.
Right. Now, the way I learned it was developing CodeFusion. Yeah, developing CodeFusion 4 and 5 websites, which basically we developed in HTML back in those crazy days. So I had to know HTML because I was generating every line of this page myself. So
exactly.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the way to do it is, again, this page becomes HTML. There's nothing hidden from you here. It's ugly, but you can run that through a code cleaner and clean it up considerably.
That's deceiving right there, the way that's all formatted.
Yeah.
So
it's
don't let
tough.
that scare you. Don't let that scare you.
But the point I was making is, there's nothing on this page that's not HTML or CSS. The page that is presented to your user in the browser is pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Yeah, when you look at ViewSource, that's what
other than those three things. So there's, if you can mock up this, if we could have mocked up this page in Coffee Cup completely static, we wouldn't have been reading the database and all that, but we could have mocked up this page in Coffee Cup or Dreamweaver of what we wanted it to look like. And that would have, just doing that would have kind of given us an idea of, HTML tables and that sort of thing. So, even taking a screen like this and just mocking it up from a static standpoint, that's all you need to be able to do. If you can do that level of work, you've got enough of a basic understanding that it no longer becomes a complete black box that you have no idea what WebDev is doing.
Yeah. So you can go to lynda.com. You can go to SiteWorks. There's a whole bunch of them in different price ranges, and some of them get pretty cheap. But look for something that has good reviews, because you sure don't want to spend the time on some junk. Okay. So anything else? Otherwise, Pete, back to work.
I'm taking the afternoon off.
Oh, good for you. I'm
still licking my wounds from last night. Alabama coughed it up last night.
Oh boy, thank you. I didn't need that visual. Alrighty, thanks again, and I'll get this up over the weekend. So I still have to get my system going here. So
if we got Marcelo typing. Oh, thanks. You're welcome. All right. Yep. I'll send you the link for the article, Arnold. But everyone should understand that it's your main system's down, so it may be a few days before you get everything.
I'll do it as soon as I can. Yep. Thanks, man.
All right. Thank you.
Happy 99.
All righty.
Stopping the recording now. Happy New Year, everybody. Bye.